There are two main cameras that I want to see Nikon come out with by the end of 2026. Cameras that would cover a lot of the holes in the Nikon Z system and revive classics that were once beloved by all. And the first one that we gotta talk about is the Nikon Z73. Now, I know what you're thinking. Isn't this a camera that already has a line? I mean, the Z7 line has been out since the Z system's inception, so why talk about this camera? Well, first off, the Z7 line feels like it's kind of lost its place in the Nikon Z system. With the release of the Z8, the Z7 now feels like a camera that is kinda awkwardly in limbo. Because a lot of what the Z7 does, being a high megapixel camera, is simply overshadowed by the Z8, because the Z8 can pretty much do everything that the Z7 does, just better. And I know there's a massive difference in price point between the two, with the Z8 being almost $1,000 more. But nowadays, it almost feels pointless to pick up the Z7 II when the Z8 exists. However, the changes I'm suggesting to the Z7 III will solve a lot of the product segmentation issues that the Z7 II currently suffers from. First off, we'll give it a way larger megapixel bump to 75 megapixels, and the big reason for this is that if the Z8 is at 45 megapixels, we can now turn the Z7 III into an even higher resolution camera that's aimed at landscape, studio portrait, and niches that require you to slow down and be more meticulous about how you craft your composition. And of course, having a 75 megapixel sensor will slow the camera down when it comes to readout speeds. But to me, this is a well worth trade-off because a camera like that wouldn't be meant for fast action anyways. Because where 45 megapixels is a good sweet spot between speed and resolution, we can go heavy in the image quality direction for a camera that's built for more fine art types of photography. With a 75 megapixel sensor, we'll get even more detail throughout our image and gives us more croppability without needing to worry about a loss of resolution. And naturally, with so many megapixels, we can see flaws in our image even more when it comes to things like motion blur. Which is why it doesn't feel that bad slowing down with a camera like this that contains a higher megapixel count. To complement the higher megapixel camera, we can also have greater dynamic range, somewhere close to 16 stops of dynamic range, where the Z7 II currently sits around 14.7. Having the increased dynamic range just means those megapixels in the shadows and highlights will retain more detail and makes the images more flexible in post-production when you're editing a high contrast scene. And for me, prioritizing dynamic range and megapixel count will be a great benefit to a lot of fine art photographers who want more flexibility in their photos. The last feature that I want to add when it comes to image quality would be 16-bit files, which would be a step up from the 14-bit files we currently are used to with Nikon cameras. Having 16-bit files will give the camera sensor more tonal and color details to capture images with far more accurate colors. This will also help when it comes to dynamic range, because we'll see greater details in the shadows and highlights for an easier time when it comes to editing in post-production. Although a lot of photographers will have a difficult time telling the difference between a 14-bit and a 16-bit file, it's just another feature that will help separate the Z7 III from the rest. And playing on the theme of a slow, high megapixel camera, it should stick with a non-stack sensor entirely. Now this might seem like a change that would be generally negative, but stack sensors have its trade-offs, with a notable difference being in the dynamic range category, as we can see when we compare the Z8 to the Z7 II, where the Z8 stack sensor comes in at 14.2 stops of dynamic range versus the 14.7 stops of the Z7 II. And that difference comes from, you guessed it, the stack sensor of the Z8. This is pretty common knowledge at this point that stack sensors will trade off dynamic range for speed. And if we're already going to have a slow Z7 III, why not just stick with a non-stack sensor in order to maximize dynamic range? Now I know a lot of the changes that I'm asking for with the Z7 III is almost purely based on image quality. But this is a camera that a lot of photographers have been asking for, and especially those who shoot a lot of landscapes, like me. Because to me, the Z8 accomplishes pretty much everything the Z7 II set out to accomplish, and now occupies this space of 45 megapixel cameras that are good at everything. So now that the Z7 was kicked out of that spot, the Z7 III can now change course and be an ultra high megapixel camera that is slow by design while capturing unreal images for those who don't mind moving a bit slower. It'd be a great way for Nikon to segment their camera bodies and ensure that each camera line has their own space within the Z system. Because it doesn't just make sense to have two cameras that do almost the same thing, but with one being clearly better. Granted, this wouldn't be the camera for everyone, but it'd be the one camera that a lot of fine art photographers have been waiting for years at this point. But this next camera is one that I think a lot of photographers would be excited to see, and that would be the Nikon Z80. Do you remember when the Nikon D500 came out way long ago in the prehistoric ages of Nikon back in 2016? Well, if you did, then you remember that the D500 was essentially a mini D850 with very similar specs, features, and design, except the D500 was an APS-C camera versus the D850 being a full-frame camera. And in the year 2025, we have the Z8, and it's time for it to have a younger sibling, which is where the Z80 comes in. This is not a Z80, but we should have a pro APS-C camera. And here's what it looked like. We'll start with a modest 24 megapixel APS-C size sensor that is stacked for faster readout speeds. Of course, you could ask for a 40 megapixel sensor, but in my opinion, 24 megapixels is more than enough, especially if the priority here is speed. At this point, we've reused the same 20 megapixel sensor from the D500 quite a lot, so I think having a refreshed 24 megapixel sensor would be just fine. And because it's an APS-C size sensor, it'll have even faster readout speeds compared to the full frame cameras we have now. On top of having a fast sensor, we should get top of the line autofocus to that of the Z8 and Z9. And the fast sensor should help it achieve faster autofocus and lock onto its subjects much faster with more accuracy. But let's not stop there. Let's have the Z80 shoot in full 30 frames per second RAW. Because even though we do have Nikon cameras that can shoot 30 frames per second, they're normally compromised in some way. There should also be no blackout shooting with a 120 frames per second viewfinder, making it easier to track your subject and ensure you see what you're shooting during a fast action scene. I'd also want to see improved dynamic range and better low light performance than we're used to with our current APS-C sensor. Because even though what we have now with our current APS-C size sensors are fine, we could do a little better. All these specs will combine to create Nikon's first professional APS-C size mirrorless camera, and to me, this should be a no-brainer for Nikon. Because when the D500 came out, it was a massive hit with lots of wildlife, sports, and action photographers really loving the speed and reasonable price point, which is exactly what Nikon needs now. Of course, the Z8 could handle a lot of these same things that I'm mentioning that the Z80 would handle, but you could get the Z80 for maybe half the price of what a Z8 would cost you. On top of it, having an APS-C size sensor has one major advantage over full frame, which is the crop factor that gets added to the lenses you put on it, turning a lens like the 180-600 into a 270-900, which is super helpful for a niche like wildlife, where you want the long reach, but might not want to carry around a huge 800mm wherever you go. And it is quite a shame that Nikon never released a successor to the D500, which is where the Z80 I think will become a major fan favorite. Nikon traditionally hasn't really done a great job at supporting their APS-C line, and is why I think a Z80 is even more important to have a better, well-rounded camera line that can tackle all kinds of niches. And even if you aren't an APS-C enthusiast, having one in your full frame kit can expand the different kinds of focal lengths you have access to and give you more options when you're out on the field. It's a big reason why I personally have a Z30 and really love using it with my camera kit. Realistically, it should be a camera that is pure speed, and if they ever came out with it, man, I would pick up that camera so fast. One thing that I will say about Nikon is that their camera line has matured quite a bit from where it started. The line feels very fleshed out, with 7 different full frame camera lines and 3 APS-C camera lines. And the only reason I'm suggesting that they need to alter the Z7 line and add in the Z80 is because a lot of these cameras are very similar to each other. They tend to be reiterations of each other while missing or adding a few features here and there to try and make them different from each other, so they can segment their product offerings to avoid cannibalizing their different camera lines. But to me, it feels like they don't really have drastically different use cases from each other, which is totally fine if your goal was to make the same tech available to everybody. But there seems to be a hunger in the Nikon community for cameras that tackle specific use cases, like a 75 megapixel camera or a rebirth of the D500. And that was my goal of this video, was to provide some insight into what kind of cameras could tackle specific use cases and what those cameras would look like. Especially with Canon and Sony being massive competitors, Nikon will need to innovate their way in order to keep up. We'll see if these two cameras ever really come to fruition, but I'm hoping by the end of 2026 that these cameras can come into reality, because I think they'd be wonderful additions to the Nikon Z line. I think Nikon has done a great job so far with their Z system, and I'm looking forward to what they'll be doing moving forward when it comes to camera bodies. But what do you think about the cameras that I'm suggesting? And are there any cameras that you would want to see from Nikon moving forward? Anyways guys, thank you so much for experiencing the world with me today. And if you like this video or want to check another one out, feel free to see it right here.